Hi all. So today we're going to look at Bernard Binlin Dadié's I Give You Thanks My God. So this is a purely African poem, and you will see how the color black and the identity of an African is celebrated throughout the poem. So here is the first movement in this poem where the poet seems to be thanking God. And why does he thank God? For having created him black. How nice. So he says, I give you thanks, my God, for having created me black. And so this poem opens up with a sense of gratitude, or rather a prayer of gratitude, where he's thanking God, and it's a direct address to God. And the speaker seems to be directly talking to God, and he's thanking God for making him black. So he says, I give you thanks, my God, for having created me black. So this line particularly comes up at a time when black people were made to feel very inferior by their colonizers. And so this statement is kind of an act of resistance. So it talks about how black is beautiful. So there was a movement which really came up with black is beautiful. And so this particular line establishes the racial pride. So rather than feeling bad about his color, the poet seems to be celebrating his identity, and he's very proud of his identity, and that's what we see here. And he seems to be thanking God for it, for having made him. So he continues to thank God, and rather he feels that he's part of God's design of creation. So his existence is basically based on God's design. And so this line is a kind of a preparatory line for the readers to understand that there's going to be a surprising description of what means to be a black. Okay? And suddenly he takes a different turn. He says the total of all sorrows. So this is a very powerful metaphor, and this particular speaker identifies himself with the whole of the African community. And if you look at African community, you see that they do not function as an individual. They'll always identify individuals, African individuals, they always identify themselves with their community. So he says this suffering is not just a suffering of an individual. This is an accumulated suffering of the black people in toto, and so it refers to centuries of slavery, exploitation, racism and oppression. So it's not just for it doesn't talk about one particular individual or one particular African and his or her suffering, but it's the suffering or the sorrows of the whole lot of the African people. And here it says the total of all sorrows. So the phrase seems to be recalling what's said in the Bible and the image of Christ that's created in the Bible. So in the Bible, according to Bible, Christ is the man of sorrows. And here the black men are equated with Christ, or the black man is equated with Christ for all the sufferings that he undergoes. So the black man becomes a symbol of humanity's suffering. And set upon my head. So there's something heavily that's rested on his head. Again, if it's to do with the thorny crown that was rested on the head of Christ, it's that. Or it's an image that suggests how heavy the burden is and how the black man or man is expected to carry that heavy burden. So the head is symbolic of responsibility and endurance. So the burden that is imposed upon him is not an individual burden. It's not something that has been passed on to him by one individual to another or by his family to him. It's been imposed upon him by history. And that's quite pathetic and painful to note. And he says the world. So the burden is now revealed. The poet seems to be metaphorically carrying the whole world or the entire world on his head. And this suggests how the black people have been tolerating it, quietly enduring it, not just normal suffering but immense suffering. And how have they been enduring it even while they were contributing towards a greater civilization? And this image of the world also recalls the Greek mythological character Atlas, who is believed to have carried the heavens on his shoulders. So, such is the burden and such is the heaviness of the burden that these black men and women carry, or the Africans in general carry. And then he says, I wear the livery of the centaur. See, an individual's suffering is equated with a community. So, a centaur, we all know that it's a mythical half human, half horse creature. And this livery is nothing but a clothing or a uniform. So, here again, he says, I wear the livery of the centaur, meaning to say that Africans generally have a kind of endurance and a physical strength that is incomparable. Okay, so they are very strong, they're quite enduring also. So this particular line indicates that. And then he says, it also might refer to how the black people were viewed historically. They were not looked at by their colonizers as human beings. They were looked at as people who were uncivilized. Okay, so this talks about how the racist societies viewed the Africans as in a dehumanized way. So it was kind of a racial dehumanization. And so at the same time, the poet seems to be celebrating their resilience also. All these they suffered, but they always withstood it, fought back, and they were resilient. Okay, and now he says, I carry the world since the first morning, since the day it was created. This is how it has been. So since its existence, from the beginning of his history, from the day we were born here in this earth. So from the first morning, meaning to say from the dawn of humanity, so we, the black people, have always carried suffering and responsibility with us. And throughout human civilization, this is what we've been experiencing. And that's quite traumatic, that's quite painful, that's quite humiliating. Okay, now he comes to a different point. He says, white is a color, but then it's a color that's improvised for an occasion. So here all of a sudden he talks about the color. He says he thanks God for making him black. But now he says, yeah, we understand there is yet another color that can be contrasted with this black, and that's white. So this white, he says, this can be improvised. So you keep improvising on this color. That is to say, you keep doing with it, you keep correcting with it. And so this is not a natural color, this is an artificial color, this is an accidental color, and this color is not for everyday use. It's just used for an occasion. It's just used during special circumstances. But then, how is black? Black is the color of all days, and it has something to do with permanence. It has something to do with universality. So he associates endurance with black. And not just that, it's not the color like the white, which is the color of an occasion, which is the color for a particular circumstance. Black is the color of everyday life. So it represents everyday life. And so black is normally, or the poet associates black with continuity and strength. And this is a very, very popular line of this poem. And he says, and I carry the world since the first night. So since the day the humanity had dawned, since the day the morning dawned, so it complements with the first morning. So the first night, since that time, black people are known for their endurance. So the endurance is not something that is popped up all of a sudden, but that's timeless. So he talks about the black endurance and its timeless nature. And so now we move on to the second movement. He says, I'm happy. Whatever I am, however I look, I'm happy. And isn't it a very surprising declaration, a celebratory declaration? So saying, despite all the suffering that we have undergone, we are still happy. I'm happy, which means to say my race is happy, my people are happy, my whole continent is happy. And so he says, do not look at us pathetically. We do not want to be victimized. And he refuses to be a victim, or refuses to don on the attire of victimhood. And so this line, I'm happy, talks about his physical strength, not just his strength, the strength of his people, of the Africans. And now he comes on to talk about each part of his body which have been condemned and condescended by his colonizers. And he says, with the shape of my head, I'm happy. He celebrates his physical features, and he colonizers normally or generally mocked at their physical characteristics. But the poet doesn't want to be subjugated that way. He rejects such prejudices. And he says, he fashioned to carry the world. So his head, he says, it's so strong that it can carry any sort of burden. It can bear any sort of burden. So here, his head, the physical image that has been condemned by his colonizers, becomes a symbol of resilience, a symbol of strength, a symbol of endurance, a symbol of fortitude. Okay, so satisfied with the shape of my nose. And the shape, we know that the Europeans had certain standards of beauty, or certain standards of goodness or in people. And so here the African's nose also was not too appreciated. But then the poet comes forward to celebrate the African physical features. So it is in no way aligned with the European beauty standards. So his nose, which is not appreciated by the Europeans, it becomes a source of pride. And he's not bothered about whether his nose is appreciated, accepted, or whether they really like it or not. He is happy with whatever he's got. And we should breathe all the air of the world. He says, my nose does its function well. And what's the function of the nose? To breathe air, to inhale life. And so he's saying, my nose is capable of breathing, and this nose, which is capable of breathing the air, which is free, is a symbol of freedom. And he says he doesn't stop with that. It even further implies that he has the right to breathe the same air as everyone else. And so it talks about a universal human dignity. Okay, so now he's happy, and this happiness, when it is reinforced, when it is repeated, it talks about his contentment. And he even moves further to declare about his pride, which is unshaken. And he doesn't stop with his head and nose. He moves to talk about his legs also, the way his legs are formed. And again, he seems to be celebrating his body, the physical feature, which he sees as worthy of appreciation, which he feels is really to be admired, which he feels has all the aesthetic values. And so he's so happy about his form of legs also. And he says, the legs are so strong that they are prepared to run through all the stages of the world, whatever they may be. So he says that the legs have the endurance, the fortitude, and tolerance to participate in history by running across the different parts of the world, or different stages, different historical stages of the world. And this is a kind of reminder of how the black people have survived throughout each stage of the history, despite their sufferings and despite all obstacles. They've been always surging ahead, marching forward, moving ahead. So this is something really, really worth emulating from those friends of from our African friends. Okay, so now we move on to the third movement, and here he comes back with a reminder of how he should be grateful to his God. He says, I'm thankful to you, my God, for having created me black. And this is a kind of a refrain, and you know the refrains normally have the function of repetition, and whenever there is a repetition, it's quite emphatic. It has so from the oral tradition, we know that all the works of their oral tradition were kind of chants also, and these chants had refrains in them. And so when the refrains are used in the poems, they have the function of being of reminding us of their oral tradition, where they had refrains which had the function of repetition. And repetitions normally were emphatic in nature. They emphasized or they stressed upon particular concept or idea or value, and here it's the theme of gratitude that's being stressed upon, and it's also the theme of racial pride that's highlighted. So what is he happy about, or what's he grateful for having made him, for having created him? And so this is a thought. He's happy that in God's plan of creation, in God's design of creation, he has found a place, or the black people have found a place, the Africans have found a place. Again, he comes back to talk about the total of all sorrows. So this suffering is not an individual suffering, it's an emphasis upon the communal suffering, and how the suffering itself has turned out to be a kind of a source of strength rather than defeat. So now he goes further to specify with some specificity. He says, 36 swords have pierced my heart. Again, piercing of the sword, or the piercing of this piercing of the sides of Christ, remind us of the biblical Christ, or there is a biblical allusion again referring to Christ, which is a powerful image of pain. And the number 36 also talks about repeated suffering, not just once, twice, thrice, but 36 times his heart has been pierced with swords. Oh my God, isn't it too much? And now the heart is refers to all the emotional wounds. It's not the physical wounds. Physical wounds, they'll heal anytime. But there are deeper wounds. The wounds are in their heart, and these wounds are emotional wounds, and it takes a lot of time for them to heal. So again, it talks about Christ's suffering during the crucifixion, and it continues. He says, 36 brands have burned my body. We all know that a brand is a burning iron, and they normally use it on the slaves to mark the slaves. And so this line reminds of slavery and the history, the suffering, the pain, everything associated with slavery. And all of these 36 brands have burned his body, and they refer to the torture that the Africans have undergone as during the slavery, the racism that they have met, the oppression that they have been into. And so the suffering is both physical, historical, emotional, psychological, and whatnot. So, and then he says, and my blood on all the Calvaries has reddened the snow. So Calvary is again is a reference to the hill where Christ was crucified. So it's a biblical allusion again. So the suffering of the Africans is again compared to Christ's sacrifice, which has been witnessed by people across the world. And there the snow symbolizes the white lands or the foreign territories, the lands of the colonizers, and here the blood signifies the sacrifices that the African brethren have made across the world. So this is one of the most powerful images that you find in this poem. And he says, and my blood from all the east has reddened nature. And he says the suffering is not just to the suffering of the Africans is not restricted to their colonizers' land alone, but it extends beyond there to distant regions. And the word blood, it becomes a symbol of sacrifice, not just an individual sacrifice, but a sacrifice of the community that you see across the globe. So now we come across the fourth movement, and here there's a turning point, and he says, and yet I am. So despite all of these suffering, the speaker is not broken, the speaker is not shattered, the speaker remains positive, and he's saying, I'm happy to carry the world. So what if I'm burdened? If I have to carry the world, that's okay. I can always carry the world, I can always carry the burden. So the suffering has not brought him down, rather he is rising above it, and it has in fact strengthened him. So the suffering is a source of his strength, and he still says, content with my short arms. So he's saying, even if I have defects, I'm happy with what I am, and he appreciates whatever, however he looks. And he's saying, even if others reject my appearance, even if others reject my body, even if others make me feel inferior, I'm not going to feel inferior. I'm happy with what I am, and I'm thankful to God for what He has created me. So he's happy with the long legs, again another affirmation of his physical identity that we discussed earlier. And he's proud of each and every feature of his body. With the thickness of my lips, we know that our African friends have very beautiful thick lips. And so this line really challenges the racist stereotypes, because we know that the Europeans had a different standard of beauty, and for them thin lips were really very beautiful. But then I feel that the thick lips of the African brethren or fraternity is really very attractive and appealing. So the features that were once mocked by the people who subjugated them, the Africans, now the poet takes a chance to celebrate all that they were mocked for. So he transforms all the prejudices into pride, all the colonial prejudices into pride. And so this is the final movement of the poem. Here he says, whatever it may be, whatever suffering I have to undergo, I give you thanks, my God. For what? For having created me black. And so we see that the oral tradition is incorporated into this poem. There is a chanting that takes place, and the refrain appears once again. And he is thankful to God for the way He has created. And still, even when he thinks of all the humiliation that he has undergone, there is not a bit of change, or not an iota of change in him. He still remains unchanged. And so again he comes back to the same concept of white is a color for an occasion. So he returns to the earlier contrast, and he says white is temporary, but you see black is the color of all days, which means to say he symbolizes or black symbolizes permanence, endurance, fortitude, universality. And he says, and I'm not in any way affected or any way moved by the sufferings that I have to, or by the burden that I'll have to bear. I still carry the world, and I carry the world since the morning of time. So he says, though the burden has been existent since time immemorial, or since the humanity began, but then this black experience has a historical scope, but still I continue to carry it. And he's saying, and my laughter in the night brought forth day over the world. So this is the climax of the poem. The night, always referring to suffering, slavery, pain, anguish, despair, hopelessness, colonialism, and oppression. But then, what did he do? He overcame all of that with his laughter. And he says, so laughter is something that symbolizes hope and resilience. And the speaker's spirit is created here. There's light that comes out of darkness. And even in pain, he becomes a source of renewal for humanity. So now he is still very constant. There is no change at all from what he began in this poem. He says, I want to thank you, my God, for having created me black. And that's how the poem ends, the way it began. And we know that the Africans normally believe in the circular motion of everything, life and death and everything. So here the poem began with this, I give you thanks, my God, for having created me black. and it ends with that. So it talks about the circular structure, reinforcing the message that gratitude triumphs over suffering. So the final line is a kind of a declaration of dignity, self acceptance, and cultural pride. Okay, so the poem is both a prayer and a protest. So Daddy seems to be transforming the historical suffering of the black people into a source of strength and dignity. So he does that, or he's able to achieve that through various allusions like biblical allusions or drawing imagery from the Bible, through mythological references, through his own communal, through his own oral tradition, and the basic technique that's employed in the oral tradition is repetition, and you also find that there are powerful symbolism. So through all of these things he's able to achieve that. So the poem is both a prayer and a protest, and he proclaims that black identity is not a cause for shame, but it's a reason for gratitude. Yeah, you should be grateful for who you are, for what you are, and he's happy about it, and he's very grateful. Isn't it a lesson to learn for all of us? So the poem is one of the finest affirmations of black pride in African literature, and please understand, it is a mirror of the spirit of the negritude movement, where black is celebrated, African culture is celebrated, African identity is celebrated, and resilience is celebrated. I hope you enjoyed this poem. Thank you so much for watching this.